Welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Howie Jacobson. Excited to let you know that you can now pre-order my new book, You Can Change Other People, the 4 steps to help employees, colleagues, even family up their game. I wrote it with Peter Bregman, who is my coach teacher, my coaching mentor, and it's now available for pre-order. And when you pre-order, you get a whole bunch of fun, valuable bonuses, including 3 recorded demo conversations where we show you exactly how to go through the 4 steps with real people, and a 1-page cheat sheet so you can follow along. The book itself, when you pre-order, will arrive in your mailbox or inbox on September 22nd, 2021. Here's how to do it. Go to plantyourself.com/pre. That's just P-R-E, all lowercase. That will forward you to the page on the Bregman Partners website that has all the information about how to pre-order. Basically, you just order somewhere, either online or at your local independent bookshop, and you send us the receipt via email, and then you get your bonuses. So I'm really hoping that you will help me make this book a big success. I hope you will find it very valuable, and that once you get it and read it, you'll use it and recommend it to others. And so if you've been listening to this podcast for a while and you have gotten value, this is a really easy way for you to give back. It would be a huge help. So again, that's plantyourself.com/pre, P-R-E, all lowercase. All right, let's get to today's show. One of the things I love about my work is that I get to approach it very holistically. So the bulk of my work is helping people change behaviors, whether it's my health and well-being clients who are looking to shift how they eat and move and sleep, or my corporate executives who are looking to change patterns that are keeping them limited or stuck around communication or taking action or procrastination or priorities and things like that. Because I have a strong foothold in both the behavioral and the biological worlds, I get to see things differently than, let's say, the psychologist who only focuses on the contents of our thoughts, or the biochemist who's really just looking at the impact of food compounds on our physical bodies. And today's guest helps me bring those two into a very clear and synergistic focus. Taylor Sittler, MD, is a medical advisor for Levels Health, which I've already interviewed one of the founders of Levels Health, Dr. Casey Means, about continuous glucose monitoring and metabolic health. And Dr. Sittler is really interested in resilience, in how we bounce back, how we recover, how we don't get thrown too far off base by life's stressors. And he's speaking about resilience, again, in that holistic way, both psychological, emotional, life stressors, and the physical stressors we put on our bodies through the food we eat, through how we sleep or don't sleep, the chemicals we're in contact with, and the ways we stress and recover our bodies physically. So if you feel a little bit beaten down by the past couple of years with COVID, with political instability, with environmental disaster looming, and you just feel like you haven't been bouncing back the way you'd like to contribute the way you'd like, I think this will be a very valuable, useful conversation for you. So without further ado, Dr. Taylor Sittler, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Thanks for having me, Howie. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about a concept that you've been exploring and noodling around with for a while, resilience. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I think the way that we think about health these days is the absence of disease, right? When you feel like if you don't have a diagnosis, you're good. And I think we need to flip that. I think we need to start thinking about health in terms of how your body responds to the stressors that life throws at you. And that's resilience.
Okay. I was about to ask you for a definition. You just gave one. So it's your body's ability to respond to life's stressors.
Yes.
And of course, the catch is we don't know what those will be.
That's right. And we know that they're going to be there, and we know that there are lots of them, but we don't know what they're going to be.
So that reminds me, like when I studied public health gosh, decades, in the early 1990s, we were all excited about this new World Health Organization definition of health, which was like basically something like a complete state of mental, physical, and emotional well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. And of course, nobody knew what that meant or what to do about it. But it sounds like your definition is a lot more functional, actionable, and to some degree measurable, right? Like you can sort of stress test your resilience against life, both in actuality and hypothetically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, part of the impetus for this and the realization for me was that's actually a lot of the tests that we do in a medical context are actually testing your resilience. So when you do an oral glucose tolerance test, for instance, when your doctor has you drink a slug of glucose, or when you do a cardiac stress test, that's testing your resilience. And this, and the good news is that we already practice some of this. But I think it's really just drawing attention to it so that all of us can be aware of it, and that we're not just doing this in a clinical context.
And to some extent, I think resilience is a hard sell in the same way like prevention is a hard sell in pretty much any field, like life insurance or like home alarm systems or eat right so you don't get sick later, right? Like,
yeah, I think the difference between prevention and resilience is, I think, as a person, when I think about preventing disease, I'm kind of just waiting for something to happen. Whereas when I think about resilience, it actually can tie into my everyday life pretty well. So, how did you respond to that all-nighter that you took? Right? How did you recover from that last workout? Did it feel good or not? Right? How did you respond when your boss criticized you last week? Were you able to take it, or were you home fuming about it for hours? Right? And by looking at these things in our everyday lives that often many of us want to improve. I mean, I want to have a better workout. I want to be able to recover from a sleepless night. I want to be able to deal with criticism well. That really, I think, aligns our definition of health with our definition of who we want to be. And I think that's really what resilience is about for me, is aligning this idea of health with the things that we really want to achieve in life.
And it seems like when you mentioned like the different things we want to be resilient in the face of, I'm sort of characterizing them in two different ways. One is like unfortunate stuff that we might have to deal with, like an all-nighter. I'm thinking back to when decades ago when my daughter was very young and we thought she'd burst her appendix, and like I got out of bed and went to the hospital and spent, all night having tests. Like I was glad I could stay awake and function at work the next day. Right. But that's like, okay, something unfortunate and unforeseen that life may throw at you. But there's also like your workout, which is presumably not only something to be resilient in the face of, but a mechanism for increasing your resilience.
Yeah. And that's where, in the right measure, I think practicing resilience can improve it, right? Or practicing being exposed to those stressors can improve it. And that we see that in stoicism on the mental side. And we see that in terms of workouts on the physical side. I think, when we think about metabolism, it can be a little bit tricky because if we think about our metabolic state, often we're sort of overfeeding ourselves all the time. So we're in a constant state of over processing of glucose. And so that when you go too far on that spectrum, you're not increasing resilience by stressing yourself. You're just, you're kind of wearing yourself out. And we see that in the exercise realm too, where, there's this thing called overtraining, where if you work out every day, you don't give your body enough time to recover. You don't actually build that adaptation and resilience. You're just not going to have a good workout. You're just kind of miserable. So I think building resilience, is important too. And, but it needs to be done in sort of the right measure.
Hmm. So when, we can talk about sort of mental and emotional resilience, and I think there's fascinating concepts around that. Not a ton of hard scientific data, but we are getting some really interesting data around metabolics, right? And I know your company
Absolutely.
Levels is part of that quantification movement. And I don't know if you know, but I met Levels and Dr. Casey through I have a plant-based podcast. So, I want everybody to be vegan. And I realized coming into this conversation, like, oh, I had this whole list of things that I want you to tell me are true, as opposed to like, let's hear what the science is, and then we can deal with like what that means and what we want. But
Yeah.
what does the science say about, first of all, how resilient or not resilient most of us are, and how that plays out in our lives?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll back up a little bit and talk about the metabolic health crisis and kind of how we got here as a
Great,
society,
great.
because I think that's really important context to our resilience in metabolism. So today, 1 in 3 Americans have prediabetes, and 9 in 10 of the leading causes of death in the U.S. are caused by or worsened by metabolic dysfunction. So we know that there's a core problem here related to metabolism. Worse yet, most of those people don't know they have prediabetes. They don't know that they're at risk. And about 70% of them they're going to have diabetes within 10 years. So there's a major problem that's just continuing to hit us, and people just don't know that it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
The crisis has been mounting for a long time. I'd be interested in how you got interested in this space, because I imagine there might be some parallels. But I first encountered this back in medical school when, during my public health training, they had these maps of the US and the increasing levels of obesity. At that point, it was called the obesity epidemic.
Yeah.
And it almost looked like an election map where you just saw these states flipping as things were getting worse and worse. I think, but it's been going on since, for a long time, since before I was born, I think. And Michael Pollan, I think, has a really great perspective on this that he brought out. It was a while ago now in Omnivore's Dilemma, where he compares this obesity epidemic to the alcohol epidemic in the 19th century. And this was a time where employers were actually expected to provide hard alcohol to their employees, and people were drinking at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And of course, this had predictably pretty serious consequences in certain terms of productivity, community, family stability. And it gives you a sense for why we actually went through this period of prohibition, because that was way too much. Now, the crisis that we're facing today, the obesity epidemic, I think actually is as serious as this alcohol crisis in the 19th century. It's just that it's been much more silent because the effects happen more slowly.
Right. So I really am excited to kind of talk to you about the science, but I want to put it in the context of the narratives that people are are pushing. And so my plant-based community has a narrative. The keto paleo community, Nina Teitholz and Chris Kresser have a completely different narrative. And it's like we don't talk to each other. We just keep unloading our facts on the table, and and there's all the other sort of theories, whether it's vaccines or antibiotics in the food supply, and like it either becomes so complicated that there's nothing we could ever do about it, or everyone's got I don't know, chlorinated water or fluoride in the food, or 5G or whatever it is, that it feels like this thing that seems pretty inexorable has become a political football, and the cost of that has been an inability of communities to sort of come together and say, like, what's actually going on. So first of all, how complicated is it from your perspective? Like, could we
You
do
mean
a
the
thing?
metabolic health crisis?
Yeah, could we do a thing and fix it?
Well, yes. I mean, I think we could do one thing and fix it. I think the reason, I think it's not going to be that simple though, because the food that we eat is inextricably linked to the culture that we have and the people that we spend time with.
Mm.
And it's really, I think, the biggest thing that we could do to change the metabolic health crisis is to change our eating patterns, right? What we eat and when we eat. But changing that is complicated. I think anyone who has tried to help people do that will tell you that that's complicated. So, I mean, if I had to give a single solution for this to try and solve it, I would say fasting. I would encourage people to do 16-hour fasts regularly and potentially a couple-day fast periodically. That, I think, corrects the metabolic markers more quickly than anything else. It doesn't address everything, but to me, that would be the single biggest fix. It's literally just giving your body a rest from metabolism.
So
there are lots of different opinions.
Yeah. Can I stop you there?
Sure.
Because there was just an article, I'm imagining you've seen it. It came out maybe in the past 2 weeks, basically saying that intermittent fasting appeared to have no effect on obesity. And so people were touting this as the intermittent fasting people, there's this whole culture of hack your body, and it's just more BS.
Well, so I think there are articles coming out all the time on both sides, right? What I think we now have pretty solid evidence that's been amassed over the last 20 years that fasting at intervals is helpful. We don't yet know how long that interval needs to be. We don't know how often, but we do. I would point to the most impressive study to me was really the Sachin Panda study from 2013. That of course was done in mice, and people will take issue with it. I think since then we've done studies showing that we get some of those same effects in people. And certainly in my own diet, I've found because I'm now measuring my glucose. When I do fasting, my glucose stays more stable than when I don't. So I think to say that intermittent fasting as a blanket statement doesn't work is probably, I would take issue with that. I'd love to read the article, and certainly we don't know if you do intermittent fasting for 10 hours versus 15 hours, is it effective or not effective? And that may be some of it. If you do it 2 days a week versus 5 days a week, is it effective? We don't yet know. But I do think that there's a lot of, there are enough studies out there now that I don't necessarily believe the folks that now say there's nothing to fasting.
Okay. So in that,
I mean, we could talk about it. I'm happy to, I don't want to be one of those people that's just repeating their facts. So if you want to, I can look up the study. I'm happy to discuss it, and see where we could, where there might be some points of contention or
right. And I haven't looked closely at that study, but I do know one of the frustrations around studies in general, the way they get reported, is they typically look at very middle of the road differences between protocols and diets. And so the people who are doing extremes, like, in my community, the whole food plant-based eaters who are, sort of under 20% fat and not having, saturated fats, we're like, but that, like, what they said was low fat was 30%, and it doesn't, right? So, I'm curious, like, what, like, as so maybe we should talk about levels and just sort of the data that you can gather, because you're bringing, guns to a gunfight here, like, actually, in terms of, like, we have data.
Yeah. And I think, our goal in the longer term is really not to engage in too many of these, but to use data to resolve these disputes, right? I think one of the realizations that the founders of Levels had a while back is that by looking at your data, you can learn a lot. Right. And we know that nutrition is personalized. We know that people respond individually to different things. So being able to look at your own data really helps you understand what's best for you. And I would say, what Levels has done really well is educate the public about metabolic health. What is it? What's metabolic dysfunction? How should I be thinking about it? And then Levels offers a continuous glucose monitor for people to be able to monitor their metabolic health, and gives them kind of a mirror on their behavior to see in a very unbiased way, are the things that I'm doing helping or hurting my glucose metabolism?
Mm-hmm. So when I interviewed maybe a year and a half ago, Dr. Casey Means, and we talked about the relationship between, glucose stability or spiking and health. And one of the things I heard from some of my listeners who are not entirely ignorant about these topics is they felt that the science wasn't as settled about the relationship, but we can have glucose spikes from exercise, and we wouldn't tell somebody don't exercise. And so I'm wondering what your perspective is on how well we can associate certain glucose patterns with actual long-term health. What's the evidence there, and how strong is it?
Yeah, I think we're not there yet, to be honest. There are two pieces to this. I think what the research that she was talking about is that less frequent and less extreme glucose spikes have been associated with improvements in A1C over time, and have been associated with better metabolic health. I think that's pretty incontrovertible. Now, what you do, like any individual spike that you have, may or may not be indicative of that. And we can't, I want to caution against extrapolating. Maybe the way to think about it is the HbA1c is a measurement that we take, right? And that test has been associated with diabetes by the clinical community. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason for that is an A1C is a measure of kind of the average exposure of your red blood cells to glucose over the last 3 months. Right. It's a measure of the amount of glucose that's attached to those red blood cells that are circulating around in your body. And so it's a very good aggregate measure. It's like GDP, right? I think, GDP in the US probably gets measured a couple times a year. It's not something that changes day to day. Mm-hmm. Whereas your glucose is something that changes minute by minute. And so for me to tell you that you were healthy or not healthy by a single glucose spike would be really hard to do. But if I look at your A1C, which is an average over the last 3 months, that gives me some sense for how much excess glucose your body is dealing with.
Gotcha.
And so I think it's important to start to distinguish different types of measures that we make. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of the glucose patterns themselves, we're really, there are definitely trends that are emerging. And I think if we monitor glucose for days or weeks rather than just minutes, we can start to see some of those patterns. But that's something that we're really interested in studying, is looking at what are these glycemic patterns in the general population and how they correlate with the development of things like diabetes.
Because like the beautiful thing about continuous monitoring of anything is that if given an effective feedback loop, it can change, modify behavior for the better in the moment. Like there's nothing you can do with your A1C that's going to tell you, okay, like basically like eat less of this and exercise more. But right, when, there's wonderful studies from like every domain of human existence around, if you move the electricity meter from the basement to the front hall, people conserve more energy. When your car shows your miles per gallon, people like, right. So that, but the question is this a valid measure of the long-term thing we want?
Yeah. Well, and I think if we had to measure one thing, glucose is a really great place to start, because glucose is effectively your energy source. You're kind of measuring, the body does have a fuel tank, but glucose is really metered out in a very tightly controlled way by your body, so that all of your cells have the energy that they need to function. Mm-hmm. And by monitoring how that glucose level is changing, I think that's if I had to pick one molecule, that probably would be it. And it's the one we have, so we're going to make the most out of it. But it does, I think, because every single cell in your body needs to metabolize in order to live, it is something that is kind of universally applicable. And how your body, how that glucose level is kept constant, basically how your liver and your pancreas and your adipose tissue coordinate together to keep that pretty stable, tells you a lot about how healthy people are. And this actually gets back to resilience, which is the, how your body sort of deals with the things that you eat, which sometimes have high glucose, sometimes have low glucose, how quickly your glucose comes back and responds, as well as, when you're exercising, how quickly does it go up? How quickly does it go down? When you're stressed out, for instance, I'm one of those people that, when I get stressed, my glucose spikes pretty quickly. I know other people that don't have that, but, you can kind of tell how much chronic stress I'm dealing with by looking at my glucose, or I can. I mean, I feel like I can now that I'm getting used to it. And some of this, of course, is overfitting. But I think this is where the concept of resilience really comes in, is when you're monitoring yourself. You can start to see, how well is my body preparing for this stressor, and how well did it recover from it?
So one thing that's coming to me, and I don't know if this is a total tangent or not, but like when I've interacted with the medical establishment, it's usually been, I guess what you're talking about is sort of prevention or treatment. It's been like delta from what it should be, right? Like, okay, I'm there because there's something not quite right, and so I think it's very easy for us to think of our bodies in terms of deficits, in terms of lack, and the way you just described like glucose metabolism and how important it is, and all the coordination that has to happen for every single cell. Like, I'm just sitting here going, my body's an effing miracle.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I don't fault the medical community too much, because they, you want to develop things that can give you meaningful information, and you try to simplify them. But I think functionally that's what happens in medical practice, because there's not time the way that it's set up. There's not time to appreciate how amazing the body is. So we just measure it and try to do the best we can with helping people with it.
Yeah. And I don't want to like lay that all at the hands of the medical establishment in any more than, but like another example would be like your auto mechanic. Like you might take your car to the auto mechanic because something's not working, but you could still like really love and appreciate your car, and you could change the oil, and you could polish the fenders, and you could marvel at this piece of engineering, and like, when I was a kid, American cars were like largely crappy, but now like every car is amazing. Like it's very rare to hear of a car that doesn't work like really, really well. And just to come at it with that perspective, that my body isn't a thing that's constantly going wrong, but that if I treat my body the way, let's say, a car aficionado treats their vet or their Lamborghini, like that I have actually, I'm not relying on the mechanic to constantly fix things, because I'm treating it right on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I really like that. Yeah. I think appreciating the complexity and the amazingness of your body actually can really help here. Both just in the appreciation, and then think about, hey, what could I do to enable myself to be more focused, or to, recover better from my workout, or to handle a better night's sleep, to handle, whatever stressors I'm facing. Often I think when you can get that level of reflection for the things that you face in your life, I feel like you can help yourself, right? There are things that, because most of the time we're just going through the day, right? We're just, I want to get this done, and I want to get this done. We're not thinking about, hey, how could I help myself achieve these things?
Right. And also, like, what am I a Lamborghini? Am I a Hummer? Am I a Jeep? Am I Thomas the Tank Engine? Like, I'm good for something. Like, but like, what was, if we were to reverse engineer my design, like, what would I be doing? I just want to share something I just read. I don't know if it's true, because I don't have a background in sort of, human physiology, but if it is, it blows my mind. I just got it from a book by a guy named Jeremy Lent called The Web of Meaning. And he's mostly a sort of a philosopher of science, But he said like the one of the big problems of the emerging human organism is glucose fairness. Basically, to get glucose, like how do the cells, if you're just like a 2-celled organism or a 64-celled organism, like the cells aren't that smart. Like how are they figuring out how to get glucose to everything? And so like, because like there's these basic rules in which if a cell doesn't have enough, it turns on some enzyme that then says, hey, build more capillaries to me and build more capillaries next to me. And kind of like there's this emergent intelligence in the organism specifically around the problem of how do we not starve new cells, and how do we meter out this limited resource, this precious limited resource. And it was like, wow, like there is wisdom that has built me that I have no conscious access toward of.
Yes, yeah, that's definitely true. This is a concept I only get into sometimes because it can get complicated quickly, but it's related. What you're talking about is related to the idea of allostasis, which I think, most people learn about the concept of homeostasis in school, where, you get sort of knocked off and then you get back to some center. And rather than doing that, what we see physiologically, both intracellularly and in organisms, is that there's always a planning that's going on. And actually the cell or the body will not just respond to they won't necessarily just take you back to where you were, but where it thinks that you should be. It's the reason that you adapt and that you grow muscle, or that when you play tennis, you grow more bone. And these things are just built into the physiology. Cells are always planning for the future. And it's incredible that it could happen at that scale, right? That sort of 50 micrometer scale, where there's no, that level of, that level of intelligence it's amazing to think that it could be built at that level.
Well, it seems to me like that's sort of like the hallmark of any organic system that survives, is that kind of adaptive over response.
Yep. Yeah. And not just, and again, it's not, I think, the thing we all learned in school was it has some set point and gets off and goes back to the set point. But the truth is that set point changes based on what the organism thinks it needs to survive. And that's amazing.
So is that kind of the cornerstone of resilience, is the ability to, let's say as a muscle fails from weightlifting, to not rebuild to where it was, but to rebuild so that it can handle something harder next time.
Yeah, well, so I think, there's such a broad range of physiology that comes under health. And I think it definitely applies to adaptation and muscle growth. We're learning how to apply it in a metabolic context. I think, to some extent, how you respond and your insulin sensitivity and your, the inflammation in your body, the mitochondrial dysfunction, all of these things influence your level of health. And resilience, I think, plays a role in that. I'm sort of losing my train here. It gets complicated, but I think that the way that resilience really applies here is looking at the coordination that happens among the different organs, and seeing how that results in a planning, an execution, and a recovery, and then intracellularly, it's like the capacity of those cells and how they respond. So this all sounds very theoretical. So I think, yes, the concept of allostasis is really core to this all being it's kind of it's one of the core underlying processes by which I think resilience works, is that planning and that execution and that constantly preparing. So as an example, we worry about high blood pressure, right? That's something that your doctor checks for. We know it's associated with cardiovascular disease and stroke. Um, High blood pressure seems to be also a function of allostasis. So both increasing your resilience and decreasing your resilience is a function of this allostatic, your body planning for what's happened in the past. If you're constantly stressed and your blood vessels are pumping harder because you've had extra caffeine, it's harder to move the blood through your capillaries, let's say in your brain or in some of your organs, and then your body will essentially your heart and your arteries will pick a higher set point to make sure that you can continue to push that blood through. So if you're constantly, and a lot of us are, with the way that we live these days, with up all the time, being the I think for all of us it's been a stressful couple of years. There are all these sort of psychological stressors that are pushing us to be more alert, more active. That raises the blood pressure, and then the body says, oh, we've kept this blood pressure high for a while, I'm just going to increase the amount of muscle in my arteries so I can keep it higher. When you do that, of course, you reduce the compliance of those arteries, and it becomes harder to have a low blood pressure, and that leads to disease over time. So this planning process that's happening in your body all the time can be adaptive, so it can lead to better resilience, or it can be maladaptive and lead to worse resilience.
And I guess a lot of it is terms of like, what's the predictive time frame, right? Like if you get stressed out and your glucose rises and you're about to be attacked and you need all that energy in your muscles to fight or flee, like that's highly adaptive, right? So,
oh yeah. Well, I think most of these things arose from adaptive mechanisms. So, I mean, that your point is a perfect one. The other thing that happens in that fight or flight response is your body actually prepares for expected punctures, expected trauma. You're expected to get a cut or two. Maybe you're going to get hit. And so it actually revs up the arm of your immune system, specifically macrophages and neutrophils that can deal with that insult. And by having that revved up all the time, we expose ourselves to more, we basically create the conditions for plaques that show up in our arteries. So those macrophages that are around are now secreting inflammatory cytokines that cause the cholesterol to kind of bind in your arteries, and that leads to worse cardiovascular disease. So these mechanisms that, to your point, were really great on the savannah and worked really well, they don't work so well in our modern life.
So let's talk specifically about metabolic resilience and what. So with the caveat or the insight that everybody's different, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think even people are different from day to day. Like you could eat oatmeal for breakfast one morning and get a very different response than another morning, right? Like,
true. I mean, there are a bunch of different factors that influence that. And again, I think Sechin Panda has done a lot of great research on this, on the circadian rhythms. So it looks like each of our organs even has its own circadian rhythm. So there are times when your organ is more productive, and there are times when it's less productive. And our bodies follow these rhythms over time. And this is something we can look at as well. But what it means is that the analysis of these patterns is going to be pretty complex. The good news is I think we've started to see some pretty basic things emerge. Like we know, for instance, that keeping your blood sugar between 70 and 100 is ideal. 70 to 110 is great. Minimizing spikes outside of that range, other than, say, exercise and fight or flight responses, is really helpful. So I think we're starting to understand the dynamics of these things, but it's going to take some study to really nail it down. On the flip side, I think, people who I've talked to who have joined levels really get a lot of insight out of looking at their sugar over a couple of weeks. And, people identify specific foods that impact them very quickly. For me, it was, Barbara's has these very healthy oat squares that are there. It's like a cereal, and it's got a big picture of a heart on the outside. And I used to eat those because I thought, oh, this is great. This is a good morning cereal. I'd put my oat milk in, put my Barber's oat cereals in, and that spiked me almost up to 200 a couple of times. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe this isn't the right thing for me. Maybe I need to, shift to something else. So now when I do eat in the mornings, I'll do things like flaxseed or chia or something like that. It's something that's, got a little bit less, it's a little bit less in the carb spectrum. So I think it's, there's a lot that we still have to learn, but on a day-to-day level, I think there's a lot that almost anybody can glean by trying this stuff out.
Gotcha. So that raises a question for me around, like, you're eating Barber's cereal. So, it must be tasty. I'm sure you liked it. It was convenient. It was something you were used to. But was there also, like, your body telling you this is a good thing that had to be sort of contradicted by data? Like, just to give you an example, like when I'm a runner, and so, I would use heart rate monitor. And after a while, I didn't need the heart rate monitor anymore. Like, I just, like, I could calibrate my body and say, oh, this is what this feels like. And I'm wondering, like, does it feel like that? Or is it like, oh, but I really like this food and it feels like it's good for me and it's helping me, but the numbers say otherwise, so I'm going to listen to the numbers?
I think in general, I see a pretty high concordance in I, what feels like it's healthy and what the glucose tells me. So it wasn't like I felt like these were a super great food for me. It just seemed like something easy for breakfast that I kind of liked because it tasted good and it wasn't bad for me. I think if I got that while I was eating, if I got a glucose spike while I was eating broccoli and, some, like a fresh salad, I'd be like, whoa, that's, but I haven't seen that. I do think, so I think what you're talking about is this, we call it interoception, right? That it's that internal reflection, like feeling, how do I feel? I'm less of a runner today than I used to be, but I've never really had to use heart rate monitors or, I can usually tell because I've been doing it so long, I can tell my pace within about 15 seconds. Like, is it a 7:30 pace or an 8-minute pace and it always seemed funny to me that people would use their heart rate to determine how much they would push themselves, because to me, I'd been feeling how much energy I have left based on how much I push myself since I was 8 or 9, right? Like, so I think these things can be really helpful to a point, and then you can start to internalize them. And glucose to me is a little harder to feel than like your exertion level or your heart rate. Like, I can feel my heart rate pretty easily, right? But my glucose level, I've had some folks tell me that when they get spikes, they can feel kind of tingly. Like a tingly sensation or a warm sensation. I think some people get a little bit hyper, certainly in kids who have eaten sugar. Sometimes you'll see them, bounce a little bit more. But in general, I've found it hard to intuit my glucose level. I think, what I do though is I don't actually monitor my glucose all the time. I'll do it for a little while and kind of optimize my diet. And then I'll take it off and I'll just use the things that I learned. And then I'll come back to it in a month or so. Right. So I think there is congruence there between what you feel and what you measure.
And I'm wondering, this is speculative and beyond the realm of knowability, I suppose. But when I think about, like, our evolutionary heritage, there really was no need for the body to be able to assess, like, the effects of a Snickers bar, right? Like,
no, in general, I think the opposite, right? We grew up as a species not having nearly enough food. And I think all of us used to go days, sometimes weeks without food. And now we have completely the opposite problem, where we have these highly calorie packed things that we eat all the time. And so we're dealing with a problem that we never had.
Right. So, when you said, like, the number one thing I would do is intermittent fasting, and we talked about that right after talking about prohibition. I was kind of thinking you might say, like, let's do junk food prohibition, right? Like,
Oh,
what if we could only eat foods that, that were, unprocessed or hadn't been made in giant factories or didn't have added, fats, sugars, white
yeah.
carbs.
I think that would go a long way. I mean, I think a core reason that we're in this metabolic health crisis is that we are eating those processed foods that concentrate the calories in ways that we never experienced it. Whether it's drinking calories, I think drinking them through soda, for instance, is a major issue because you can just pack them in really fast. Or it's the processing of wheat and corn, corn specifically, that's enabled us to have sweeteners that are just, they just weren't around evolutionarily.
Mm-hmm. So do you have, there's the carbohydrate insulin thesis, right? That I see, people willing to die for on Twitter. So it feels like you're sort of, a good faith participant in the discussion. So from the plant-based vegan community, the party line is that intracellular fat that comes from eating saturated fats and fatty foods and animal products in particular gunks up our cells, and so we become insulin resistant. And
Mm-hmm.
therefore, that keto is kind of a cheat to just never test. Like, we don't eat any carbohydrates, so we never actually test the system. And then there's the opposing view, which I don't understand as well, or can't represent as well, but basically saying that glucose spikes in and of themselves are bad, and that's the problem. And so if we simply avoid eating those foods that spike our glucose, it doesn't matter what our insulin resistance is, because the game is blood glucose and not insulin resistance per se. And I'm wondering, first of all, have I represented those reasonably fairly and accurately, and how can we resolve those?
Yeah, I think each of those is describing a piece of the puzzle. Actually, those are it's fair. I'm definitely not an expert on the fat causing, you know, insulin resistance through the through like cellular modification. So I'd have to look into that a little bit more. I mean, my take is there's a lot of focus these days on mitochondrial dysfunction, which comes from a bunch of different places. An excess fat might contribute, but I think there are a bunch of contributions there. So some of that I guess I can't fully comment on whether those are the party arguments because I'm still getting to know the parties, if that's fair. What I
I'd rather hear from you is, based on what you know, what are the mechanisms? I don't need you to square the circle for these two fighting groups, but just like what do you see?
Yeah. So I think the important mechanisms here that dictate your insulin resistance, the amount of glucose that shows up in your system, as well as how well your resilience. I mean, I think it is how well your body responds to stressors and your risk of disease. So there are two types of issues here. There are issues that affect the cellular competence. So things that gunk up the cells, right? Whether it's mitochondrial dysfunction, we know is a big one. There are a bunch of, we know that we need certain vitamins and cofactors in order for our cells to function optimally. And the B vitamins have had a light shine on them. People have talked a lot about micronutrients, and I'm still learning a bit about that. But, basically having the right building blocks for your cells is really important. There's one more camp on the intracellular that I think is important to note here. I don't know how familiar you are with the longevity space, but the basically NAD pathways, sirtuin function, AMPK, and mTOR all contribute to how well your body and your cells are able to carry out their program. right? It impacts the methylation pattern on those cells and impacts your biological age, which is, your cells aging. And then, so that's the intracellular stuff. And then if you look at what's important intercellularly, there's trash collection in the body. So amyloid plaques that form in the brain and in some of the organs, sugar metabolism, cleaning that up, cleaning that out. And then there's also what we talked about before, which is coordination among the different organs. And that's things like insulin resistance and inflammation and how many of these macrophages and inflammatory cells you have in the body and what they're doing. So there really are a bunch of different things that contribute to your overall health. And I think each of these diets impacts the inflammation, the cellular coordination, your trash collection, as well as your intracellular function in different ways. I think the keto diet has been effective in showing that if we just reduce carb load, we get some benefits out of that, right? Is keto the absolute optimal way to do it? I don't know, right? I think plant-based diets and veganism have shown that by providing the right set of nutrients to the body, you're going to have better cellular function. And I think that those nutrients also can help balance the immune system, balance the autonomic system. So it also helps with some of those intercellular components, how the body coordinates itself. And the way that I think about each of these camps is what is the thing that they do best, right? What's the salient thing that they're showing us? And, I think so. Game Changers was the thing that convinced me to try out veganism, right? When I saw a bunch of athletes saying that they felt that veganism was giving them an edge, that tells me something, right? So I think, to me, that was really helpful. With keto, I think there are a ton of studies coming out now. I don't know what the right concentration of fat is. I'm not a believer, but I do see that the removal of carbohydrates seems to have a lot of beneficial effects in terms of your body's ability to process and maintain glucose.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So, another element of our camp is that, I think it's related to the fact that when you tell someone you're vegetarian, the first thing they're going to say is, where do you get your protein? And so I've participated in the writing of a book that basically said, don't worry about protein. It's in everything. It's really hard to be protein deficient. We don't see protein deficiency. At the same time, I'm seeing a lot of sort of a new generation of vegan doctors and researchers saying, actually, we want a lot more protein. And even, and we can do it on a vegan diet, really focusing on the beans and the lentils, and the tofu and the greens, and really cutting down on, the kind of foods that we told people that you can just eat ad libitum, potatoes and whole grain pastas and brown rice and things like that. So I'm just, and a lot of people are losing their shit, honestly, over I love this doctor and he saved my life, but he says, no oil. And this other person is saying, actually, it appears that olive oil is actually related to better metabolic. Is there something you can say that would kind of be a baseline for here's what we know about diet, and it's not necessarily totally aligned with one camp or the other, but here are some facts that even if you're not doing glucose monitoring, that would probably get you better results than if you didn't do them?
To be honest, I'm not, I haven't been in the trenches enough to be able to speak to that well. I would say, if I were more like Casey and I had a practice and I had been seeing thousands of patients, I could tell you what I learned from them, but theoretically, I don't have a great answer there. My hope is that we're going to start to monitor things beyond glucose that will allow us to give us an idea of how fat metabolism is working, potentially how protein metabolism is working, and what the other signaling issues are that are going on, so that we can help guide people in terms of their diet. And I hope that by essentially shining a light on this, we'll learn over a longer period of time. But I don't right now. I mean, the things that I can say are, we know that things have a circadian rhythm, and you go through periods of growth and you go through periods of kind of, ideally, you also have periods where you're eating less, or they're periods of catabolism, periods where you're not ingesting new things, and that enables your body to renew itself. And I would guess that during those periods of growth, proteins are really helpful. So, maybe it's in the springtime for you, or maybe it's, I mean, people don't really think about having this periodicity in their life, but when the body is trying to grow, having access to that excess protein is really helpful to enable the, new cellular growth, new structures to be built, collagen, all of that stuff. You need the building blocks when you're recovering. And I think any surgeon will tell you that, post-surgical diets are almost universally high in protein, because your body has a lot to recover from and rehabilitate for. So I think it's important to think about what you're personally trying to achieve in your life. If you're in more of an anabolic state where you're building muscle, you're trying to grow, and you're sort of you're growing, then I think more protein is really helpful. If you're in a more catabolic state in general, or just a maintenance phase, then maybe it's not so important.
One thing that comes to me is that like resilience and periodicity seem very tightly linked. It just in terms of like evolutionarily, like like periodicity is just a concept for us, for most of us these days, right? Like my house is the same temperature all the time. I have electric lights. I get the same amount of light. I can get strawberries in December, right? Like I feel like my body is totally divorced from the natural periods of boom and bust, of opportunity and threat. And we kind of have to create that artificially. Like you create artificial challenge by going for a run.
Right. Yeah, it's true. I mean, to some extent, I think if we just paid more attention, we would get steeped in that periodicity again, because it's all around us. I mean, springtime's still here. Summer's not going anywhere. I mean, now there is climate change, and we're influencing those things, but they're there. I think we've built a society that doesn't pay attention to them. To your point, we go out and get strawberries in December. And so maybe it's doing things like, just going to the farmer's market and getting what people produce locally, or, just simplifying a little bit, can be helpful. And I don't know, but that's a neat point.
Well, and I think when you talked about earlier about how hard it is to get people to change behavior, like no self-respecting Paleolithic human would have passed up a ripe fruit. Right. And our ripe fruit are the Snickers bars at the counter of Home Depot, at the checkout counter.
Yes.
Right. Like we have to be unnatural in our psychology to approach naturalness in our biology.
Yeah, that's right. I think we've, basically through, through the advertising and commercial environment that we've created, we've essentially hijacked those pathways to get people food, to convince people to buy stuff. And that's why I think, that some of these, it sort of goes along with fasting and catabolism and things like that. But taking taking a break from your phone for 6 hours, or taking a break from, sort of your daily routine for a week, by just even having a staycation, can have pretty profound effects, right? Just kind of changing your environment for a little while.
Yeah. Well, it'd be cool if we could, apply like continuous glucose monitoring to cultures in addition to individuals.
That's neat. Yeah. So seeing what the patterns are, for instance, in cities versus in the countryside.
Yeah. Or let's say, work in France versus Japan.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Wow. Yeah. I really hope we can do that. I mean, we'll start to do that hopefully on within the US within the next year or
Hmm.
so, which will be interesting, just
Uh,
kind of collecting more mass data. Then being able to compare different countries, it kind of reminds me of that they have a happiness
mm.
index, right? That which they assign to each country. We could have a glycemic index. What's the country's glycemic index? What's the average spike like? Can we infer a stress level from glucose data? That'd be cool.
Mm. So let's talk a little bit more about levels. And so, because we've
Great.
been alluding to it. So I did a couple of weeks of monitoring a while back. I think the system has changed a little bit. I think I remember reading one of the press releases that you don't have to hold the phone up to your shoulder, or it's easier to gather data now. Tell like what
We're,
describe
we're
like levels right now, and who might be interested in taking advantage of it.
Yeah, I think, anybody that's interested in how food affects their health should think about using levels. It's I think being able to see your glucose and how that core energy substrate, that core energy molecule in your body responds, is really helpful for most people who are trying to improve their health. And it the way I think about it is levels is really about trying to give people a mirror to see how their behavior impacts them. The Functionally, it's fairly similar right now. We're still using the same sensor. You still have to scan the phone at the moment, although we do expect that to change
Okay.
soon. Um, what's changed, I think, is we've gotten much better at enabling people to capture their behavior and then overlay that on top of the glucose data, so they can start to see, you can take a picture of what you were eating, or it's easier to record your workout. You can import your Apple Health data if you wear a
Hmm.
watch. So you can start to see the correlations, because that's really, I think, the most important thing to develop a good mirror and to get that sense of interoception that you were talking about before, where this data can really enhance your understanding. Is so that's what I think levels has really improved, is that ability to record your behavior in concert with your glucose.
Gotcha. And if people are interested, do they need a prescription? Can they just sign up?
Nope, they can just go to levelshealth.com and sign up. Right now there's a waiting list. Let me see. Um, yeah, so levelshealth.com has the waiting list. We're at Levels on Twitter, and there's a really great blog that I encourage anybody who's interested in this to go check out. So levelshealth.com/blog. There's a bunch of information there about metabolic health and how important it is.
Awesome. And so, as you said, like we can argue this all day, but there's something nice about data. You know.
Yeah, I love using data to resolve disputes.
Yeah. Although I was remembering like there's a scene in the Marx Brothers movie Duck Soup where Chico has dressed up like Groucho, and Margaret Dumont says to him, "But you just left. I saw you leave with my own eyes." And he goes, "Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes?" So I think we
Nice.
need cultural shifts as well as data to really take advantage of the insights.
100%. 100%. Yeah. No, in order for us to be able to solve this metabolic health crisis, it's a cultural change. I would say even more than a data change. The data is clear enough
Mm-hmm.
now. It's now engaging people at the cultural level.
Right. But, I mean, I think one of the things that helped me when I was wearing levels wasn't so much that I was learning so much, but it was more like, there's instant gratification eating a piece of chocolate. And now there was instant gratification in terms of the number. Like it was just,
Mm.
it was just interfering at a very useful moment for me psychologically. Like I don't want to eat this piece of chocolate and 2 minutes later or 5 or 10 minutes later get a bad score. Like I think there's a
Hmm.
lot of psychology
Yeah,
to
that's
it.
really powerful. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. being able to see it allows you to
Yeah.
optimize it. That's a really great
Yeah.
point.
So what are you up to now? What are the research questions that you're looking to answer? What are you looking forward to professionally in the coming year?
Yeah, well, there are a few things. I think one, what we're trying to do is potentially build a set of tools to accelerate metabolic health research. And that will hopefully make research easier overall. And then we have a bunch of great collaborators that we've already started working with that are about, some of those studies are getting close to being done. We're learning about paradoxical glucose response. We're learning about
What's that?
using continuous glucose. So some people have this unusual spike, even in unusual spike in glucose, even under a normal diet or in normal situations. And we're trying to tease out why that is. What are the factors that influence it? Separately, there's a bunch of work going on looking at for some of these diet programs that have developed, is continuous glucose monitoring useful to help people improve their response? And a lot of it, I think, is you alluded to here, that understanding having your glucose on and not wanting it to spike really helps people to adhere to some of these programs. So that's really neat. And then there are a couple of summaries that we have on the site. We did a summary of our 2021 research year, and I'm looking forward to getting all that out more. So we have a few big studies that are planned and some existing ones that we're finishing that I'm really excited about. And there'll be a lot more to come on that soon.
Awesome. Anything I haven't asked about that I should have?
No, I think this was a great discussion of a whole bunch of different things. And I really appreciate you thinking about this and taking the time to dig into metabolic health and resilience.
Oh, it's fascinating. And I'm gonna take this discussion in my head into, the broader definitions of resilience, because it feels like there's a lot of connections with mental resilience and spiritual resilience and beyond the metabolic.
Yes. Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Dr. Taylor Sittler, thank you so much for explaining things so well. Especially thank you for saying, I don't know, when you didn't know. That's like wonderful. And it's just like credibility through the roof. So thank you for that. And
oh, my pleasure. Thanks very much for your time, for your perspective. It was fun to explore this together.
Awesome. Thanks again. Have a great day, and look forward to talking to you again sometime. All right, that's a wrap. So let's talk about garden news. The garden is looking amazing. Basically, because Mia has been going out there every day and weeding a bed. And you think, like, weeding a bed, that should take maybe an hour. But, well, we have long beds and there's a lot of stuff in them, and we're looking to get out the roots. We're kind of radical about that. We're not just trying to, scrape off the top layer so the roots just grow back. And there's a lot of plants in there. Like, I would just go in with a hoe and do wholesale clearing, but I would have missed like 24 strawberry plants that I just remembered we planted last fall that are coming up and already delivering some fruit. So I would say we have like 16 beds under cultivation, and the last ones are finally getting weeded and planted. We just had a garlic harvest, and the beans are starting to come up, along with some mystery plants that I use this app, Picture This, to try to figure out what they are, and they're not. So Picture This is not quite as good with domesticated produce as it is with sort of weeds and flowers out in the wild. In movement news, Gary lent me his 37-year-old Airdyne bike. I am effing loving this thing. It's got the handles that you can go back and forth with your hands. It's got the front wheel is basically just this fan. And I'm up to an hour a day. I'm doing 2 30-minute rides. One of them is just steady state, and the other is high-intensity intervals. And I'm just loving it. And I've also added to my movement routine melt method. You can look that up. I think it's meltmethod.com. It's developed by Sue Hitzman. I'm doing the 20-minute full foot treatment every morning. So my mornings are getting pretty crowded. I have to get up kind of early to get everything in, between 20 minutes of meditation and the melt for 20 minutes, and then 12 minutes of a protocol that I got for my plantar fasciitis from my friend Carly Assay. And you can find out more about him from the several interviews I've done with him on the podcast over the years. And then after all that, I do some cardio, which is right now it's the Airdyne, designed to get me ready for the Ultimate National Championships in mid-July. So that's that. All right, time for thanks. Thanks to Will Ridenauer for allowing me to use his beautiful song Sabali Dawn, the Dance of Peace. You can find more of Will's music at his website, willridenauer.com. And of course, thanks to all of you Plant Yourself podcast patrons. Kim Harrison, Lynn McClellan, Brittany Porter, Dominic Maurer, Barbara Whitney, Tammy Black, Amy Good, Amanda Hatherley, Mary Jane Wheeler, Ellen Kennelly, Melissa Cobb, Rachel Behrens, Tina Scharf, Tina Ahern, Jen Filkinovsky, David Bizek, The Mysterious Michelle X, Elsbeth Feldman, Leah Stoller, Alan Christensen, Colleen Peck, Michelle Landry, Josina, Sarah Durkis, Kelly Cameron, Janet Selby, Claire Adams, Tom Franzek, Jeanette Benham, Gila Sert, David Donahue, Blair Cyber, Dorona Vizov, Gio and Carolyn Argentati, Jody Friesner, Misha Rosen, Michael Warbeck, Aviva Lael, Alicia Lemus, Val Linneman, Nick Harper, Bandana Charlie, Molly Levine, The Inscrutable Harry R., Susan Laverty, The Panda Vegan, Craig Kovic, Adam Scharf, Karen Burry, Heather Morgan, Nigel Davies, Marion Blum, Teresa Koppel, Julian Watkins, Breed O'Connell, Sharon Hirschman, Linda Ayad, Holm Hedegaard, Isa Tuzinwa, Connie Hainline, Aaron Greer, Alicia Davis, Heather O'Connor, Carolyn Jensen, Sherry Olakoski of Plant Powered for Health, Karen Smith, Scott Marani, Karen and Joe Crabtree, Kirby Burton, Teresa Carell, Kevin McCauley, Elizabeth Rothschild, Ann Jesse, Cheryl Dwyer, Jenny Hazelton, Peter W. Evans, Dennis Bird, Darby Kelly, Lori Fanny, Linnea Lundquist, Emily Iconelli, Levy Wallach, Rosamund McAtee, Dan Picorni, Stephen Leenan, Patty DiMartino, Mike and Donna Kartz, Deanne Bishop, Bilberry Elf, Marjorie Lewis, Tricia Adams, Nancy Sheldon, Lindsay Bayshore, Gunmarie Hagan, Tracy Gullidge, Laura Heaton, Meg from Mama Says, Stacey Stokes, Ben Savage, Michael Kay, David Hughes, Connie Rogers, Claire England, Sally Robertson, Paranganchi, Amy Daly, Brian Tourville, Mark Jeffrey Johnson, Josie Dempsey, Karen Schmidt, Pamela Hayden, Emily Perryman, Allison Corbett, Richard Stone, Lauren Vaught of Edible Musings, Aaron Hasty, Sean Owen, Sagar Naik, Erica Piedra, Danielle Roberts, Michael Lushton, Sarah Johnson, Catherine Floyd, for your generous support of the podcast. That's it for now. As always, be well, my friends.